August 19th, 1942, Dieppe, France. The temperature was 16 degrees Celsius and the sun was rising over the English Channel when Captain James Anderson watched Canadian soldiers die on a beach 800 meters from where his landing craft circled in the water. Anderson was 31 years old, a Canadian Army intelligence officer assigned to observe the Dieppe raid and report on German defensive capabilities. His orders were to land with the assault waves, observe how Germans defended a port town against amphibious assault, and survive long enough to report his findings. At 6:30 hours, watching soldiers from the Royal Regiment of Canada cut down by machine gun fire as they crossed the beach, Anderson understood that surviving long enough to report anything was going to be difficult. James Anderson came from Ottawa, Ontario. His father was a civil servant with the Department of External Affairs. Anderson grew up around diplomatic service and international relations. He studied history at the University of Toronto, graduating in 1933, then joined the Canadian Army in 1939 when war began. He was commissioned as an intelligence officer because he spoke German and French and understood military history. By August 1942, he had been analyzing German defensive tactics for 2 years without seeing actual combat. The Dieppe raid was supposed to give him direct observation of German defenses under combat conditions. It gave him that. It also gave him observation of Canadian soldiers being slaughtered on an exposed beach with no cover and inadequate fire support. The Dieppe raid was planned as a large-scale amphibious assault on the German-occupied French port of Dieppe. The official objectives were to test amphibious assault techniques, gather intelligence on German coastal defences, destroy port facilities, and boost Allied morale through offensive action. Approximately 6,100 men participated, mostly from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division.
The plan assumed surprise could be achieved and that German defences could be overcome quickly. Both assumptions proved wrong. German forces detected the approaching landing craft. Surprise was lost. The beaches were heavily defended with machine guns, mortars and artillery positioned in concrete emplacements overlooking the landing zones. The assault failed catastrophically. Of 4,963 Canadians who landed at Dieppe, 916 were killed and 1,946 were captured. The survivors evacuated after 9 hours of combat. The raid achieved none of its stated objectives. Anderson landed at 700 hours on the main beach in front of Dieppe's casino. He made it 30 meters inland before German machine gun fire forced him into cover behind a disabled Churchill tank. He spent the next 4 hours pinned down, unable to advance or retreat, watching soldiers attempt to cross the beach and get cut down. The German defensive fire was methodical and overwhelming. Every approach was covered by interlocking machine gun positions. Every piece of cover on the beach was pre-registered for mortar fire. The Germans had prepared this defense carefully and were executing it professionally. At 1100 hours, orders came to evacuate. Anderson retreated to the beach, waded into the water, and was pulled onto a landing craft that was already overloaded with wounded. The landing craft pulled away from Dieppe under continuous fire. Anderson looked back at the beach and saw abandoned equipment, destroyed vehicles, and bodies. The raid had been a complete failure. Anderson returned to England and filed his intelligence report. The report described German defensive capabilities in brutal detail. Concrete emplacements immune to naval gunfire, interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach, pre-registered artillery and mortar positions, excellent German fire discipline and tactical coordination.
Was classified and sent up the chain of command. The report concluded that assaulting a defended port directly was extremely costly and probably not feasible without much greater fire support than had been available at Dieppe. The report was classified and sent up the chain of command. Anderson expected it would contribute to planning for future amphibious operations. He didn't expect it would become the foundation for a massive strategic deception. In September 1942, Anderson was summoned to a meeting at Allied headquarters in London. He entered a room with senior British and Canadian intelligence officers. One of the British officers explained the situation. The Dieppe raid failed militarily, but it provided us with an opportunity for strategic deception. The Germans now believe we attempted to invade France at a port and failed. This reinforces their expectation that future invasions will target ports, because ports provide logistical infrastructure. If we can maintain this belief, we can divert German defensive preparations toward defending ports, while we plan to assault beaches that are less defended. Anderson listened carefully. The officer continued. Your intelligence report describes why attacking ports is extremely difficult. We want you to reverse engineer that report. Create an analysis that suggests we learned valuable lessons from Dieppe that will allow us to successfully assault a port in the future. This analysis will be deliberately leaked to German intelligence through double agents and other channels. The Germans will believe we are planning another port assault. They will reinforce port defenses. Then, when we actually invade, we will land on open beaches where defenses are weaker. Anderson understood what was being asked. Create a false intelligence report suggesting that despite the Dieppe disaster, the Allies intended to continue attempting port assaults. The report would be deliberately compromised to German intelligence. The Germans would read it and reinforce their port defenses.
Meanwhile, actual invasion planning would focus on landing at beaches. Anderson asked if this deception had official approval. The British officer said it had the highest level approval. Anderson asked if lying in an official intelligence report troubled anyone. The officer said, "We're not lying to our own command. We're creating a document specifically intended to deceive the enemy. That's not lying. That's psychological warfare." Anderson spent October 1942 writing a false intelligence assessment titled Lessons Learned from Operation Jubilee, Port Assault Tactics for Future Operations. The document analyzed the Dieppe raid and concluded that with improved tactics and greater fire support, assaulting defended ports remained viable. The document recommended specific modifications to assault techniques: better naval gunfire preparation, more extensive air support, heavier tanks with greater armor. The document was carefully crafted to appear authentic. It included enough tactical detail to be credible. It acknowledged the failures at Dieppe while arguing they were correctable. The document was designed to convince German intelligence analysts that the Allies intended to assault another port using refined tactics. The document was classified secret and distributed through normal intelligence channels to various Allied headquarters. This ensured that German agents operating within Allied organizations would encounter the document and report it to German intelligence. Double agents controlled by British intelligence were also provided with excerpts from the document and encouraged to transmit them to their German handlers. By December 1942, German intelligence had received the false assessment through multiple independent sources. The repetition from different sources increased credibility. The Germans believed the Allies were planning future port assaults. Anderson watched this deception unfold with mixed feelings. He had written a truthful report describing why port assaults were extremely difficult. Then he had written a false report suggesting port assaults remained viable. The false report was being successfully transmitted to German intelligence. The Germans were reinforcing port defenses in response. This meant the deception was working, but it also meant Anderson had created a document that was completely contrary to his professional assessment. He understood the strategic justification. Deceiving the enemy saved Allied lives, but writing deliberate falsehoods as an intelligence officer felt wrong in ways Anderson couldn't fully articulate. In January 1943, Anderson was assigned to work with the deception planning staff for Operation Overlord, the eventual D-Day invasion. His role was to continue developing false intelligence documents suggesting port assaults, while actual planning focused on beach landings in Normandy. Anderson created monthly intelligence assessments describing Allied preparations for port assaults at Calais, Boulogne, and Le Havre. These assessments were deliberately leaked through the same channels. German intelligence received them, analyzed them, and concluded the Allies were preparing multiple port assault operations. German defensive planning prioritized defending ports. The deception worked for nearly 2 years. Between September 1942 and June 1944, German defensive preparations focused heavily on protecting ports, while beach defenses remained relatively lighter. When Allied forces landed at Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, German forces were positioned to defend ports rather than open beaches. The deception contributed to Allied success on D-Day by ensuring German defensive emphasis was misplaced. Anderson's false intelligence assessments had been one component of a larger deception operation that included fake radio traffic, double agents, and political disinformation.
All components worked together to convince Germans the invasion would target ports. Anderson observed D-Day from Allied headquarters in England. He watched reports come in describing the beach landings in Normandy. The landings were difficult and costly, but successful. German beach defenses were substantial, but not as concentrated as they would have been if Germans had anticipated beach assaults. Anderson understood that the deception he helped create had contributed to this success. He also understood that 916 Canadians had died at Dieppe in August 1942, providing the foundation for the deception. Their failed assault on a port convinced Germans that future assaults would also target ports. The deaths at Dieppe were not militarily successful, but they were strategically useful. This distinction troubled Anderson. After D-Day succeeded, the deception operation was gradually revealed to Allied planners, who hadn't been aware of it during the war. Anderson's role in creating false intelligence assessments became known within intelligence circles. Some officers praised the deception as brilliant strategic thinking, others criticized it as dishonest. Anderson received both praise and criticism without commenting on either. When asked how he felt about writing false intelligence reports, Anderson said only, "I did what was necessary for the strategic situation." Anderson remained in the Canadian Army after the war, continuing in intelligence roles. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1960 at age 49. He moved to Victoria, British Columbia, and worked as a consultant for various government departments. He never discussed the Dieppe deception operation publicly. The operation remained classified until the 1970s. In 1972, a military historian named Dr. Michael Howard published a book about Allied deception operations during World War II. The book described Operation Fortitude and mentioned that deception planning had been informed by lessons from Dieppe. The book suggested that the Dieppe failure had been strategically useful, even though tactically disastrous. Anderson read Howard's book and wrote him a letter. Anderson was 61 years old. The letter explained his role in creating false intelligence assessments after Dieppe. Anderson described how the failure at Dieppe had provided credibility for deception operations, suggesting future port assaults. Howard requested an interview. Anderson agreed, but asked that the interview remain confidential until after his death. Howard agreed. They met in Victoria in 1973. Anderson described the deception operation in detail. The false intelligence reports, the deliberate leaking to German intelligence, the German response reinforcing port defenses, the contribution to D-Day success. Howard asked if Anderson felt conflicted about writing false intelligence reports. Anderson said yes. Intelligence work requires accuracy. Analysts are supposed to provide truthful assessments. I wrote false assessments deliberately designed to deceive. This served strategic purposes, but it violated professional ethics. I understood the justification, but I never felt comfortable with it. Howard asked if Anderson would have refused to create the false reports if ordered. Anderson said no. The strategic necessity was clear. Deceiving the enemy saved Allied lives. My discomfort was less important than operational success. I did what was ordered and what was necessary, but I didn't pretend to feel good about it. Howard asked about the relationship between the Dieppe casualties and the deception's success. Anderson was quiet for a long time. 916 Canadians died at Dieppe. Their deaths were not strategically planned as deception. The raid was supposed to succeed. It failed catastrophically. But the failure provided an opportunity for deception. Does that mean their deaths were useful? Strategically, yes. Morally, I don't know how to answer that question. They died in a failed assault. We used that failed assault to convince Germans we would assault ports. The Germans believed us and positioned forces wrong. Allied soldiers at Normandy benefited from that misplacement. Did the men who died at Dieppe contribute to D-Day success? Indirectly, yes. Did that justify the operation that killed them? I can't answer that. Howard's interview with Anderson remained confidential until Anderson died in 1989 at age 78. Howard then published portions of the interview in a revised edition of his book about Allied deception operations. The publication revealed Anderson's role for the first time publicly. The book described how Dieppe's failure had been strategically converted into deception success. Some veterans organizations praised Anderson for contributing to D-Day success. Others criticized him for writing false reports that dishonored accurate intelligence work. Anderson never responded to either praise or criticism because he was dead. In 1994, a German military historian named Dr. Wolfgang Schmidt was researching German intelligence assessments of Allied invasion planning. Schmidt found German documents from 1943 to 1944 showing that German intelligence believed Allied forces were preparing to assault French ports. The documents cited multiple intelligence sources, including captured Allied planning documents describing port assault tactics. Schmidt recognized these were the false documents Anderson had created. Schmidt traced the documents' path through German intelligence networks and concluded they had been highly influential in German defensive planning. Schmidt wanted to understand the Allied perspective on creating these false documents. He contacted Howard, who provided Anderson's interview transcripts. Schmidt read Anderson's description of creating false intelligence assessments and his moral discomfort about doing so. Schmidt wrote a paper analyzing the deception from German intelligence perspective. The paper concluded that German analysts had been unable to detect the false documents because they appeared authentic, came from credible sources, and were consistent with German assumptions about Allied tactics. Schmidt noted that Anderson's discomfort about writing false reports had not prevented him from writing them effectively. The lesson from Anderson's story is not primarily about deception tactics or intelligence operations. It is about the moral complexity of using military failure for strategic advantage. Dieppe was a tactical disaster that killed 916 Canadians and achieved none of its stated objectives. But the failure convinced Germans that Allied port assault tactics were flawed but improvable. This belief, reinforced by Anderson's false intelligence reports, led Germans to over-defend ports while under-defending beaches. The strategic deception worked. D-Day succeeded partly because German forces were positioned to defend against port assaults that never came. Anderson's role was creating the false intelligence documents that sustained the deception. He understood this was strategically necessary. He also understood it violated the professional ethics of accurate intelligence analysis. He did the work because operational necessity outweighed professional ethics. But he never reconciled the contradiction. He carried the discomfort for 47 years until he died. The deception saved Allied lives. The false reports Anderson wrote contributed to that success. Anderson accepted both of these facts without feeling good about either one. The relationship between Dieppe's casualties and D-Day's success is indirect but real. The Canadians who died at Dieppe weren't sacrificed for deception purposes. They died in an assault that was supposed to succeed and failed. But their deaths provided the foundation for deception because the failed assault convinced Germans that Allied port assault tactics needed improvement.
Anderson exploited this German belief by creating false documents suggesting those improvements were being developed. The Germans believed the deception because it aligned with what they already thought they knew from Dieppe. Sometimes military failures become strategic opportunities. Dieppe failed as an assault, but succeeded as a deception foundation. Anderson's false intelligence reports converted tactical disaster into strategic advantage. This conversion required deliberate dishonesty in official documents. Anderson accepted the necessity while rejecting the comfort. He did what was ordered and strategically required. He felt conflicted about it for the rest of his life. Both things are true. The deception worked and saved lives. Anderson never felt good about his role in making it work. Strategic success and personal discomfort coexisted without resolution. Sometimes that's what serving strategic necessity looks like. You do what works, even when it feels wrong, and you carry the discomfort as the price of effectiveness.